Hey everyone. Getting a new pet is undoubtedly a joyous milestone for many households, and starting off on the right foot is important. Now, some new owners may knowingly be taking on a pet with health issues, but in the vast majority of cases, the new pet parents will be making an assumption that their pet is healthy, and also that the pet poses no health problems to themselves, and in particular their children. Now, pardon the title, but we do want to avoid the situation of the new pet bringing some additional pets home with them, whether lice, that is after all what the expression of feeling lousy refers to, fleas, or as we'll be sticking to in this presentation, worms. Now we'll mostly be sticking to dogs in this talk, largely because we've just completed a study looking at the prevalence of nematode parasites in dogs in pounds and shelters in New Zealand. Now this study is pertinent because there has been in recent years a big push to encourage the adoption of pets from shelters rather than from breeders and places like trade meat. Now, even more so recently, and in countries like the UK, and even here in New Zealand, animals were effectively stripped from shelters and other sources as people sought to enrich their lockdown experiences. Now, whether all this adoption was a good or a bad idea is, of course, another story. Now, although the focus of our study was on shelter animals, this talk will be largely applicable to all new pet dogs, whether from a shelter, city council pound, or a breeder, or even a puppy farm. Whether a bouncing puppy or a sedate old fellow, what are the chances the new dog has worms? And has it been, or will it be effectively treated as part of the rehoming process? I say effectively treated, since not all wormers are effective against all worms, and since theoretically and practically, no wormer is going to be 100% effective, and not all the time. Now, moving an infected pet, even into an environment that has not had dogs in it before, or that agricultural land turned over to new sections, may be a recipe for problems developing in the future. Now, from late 2018 to early 2020, we collected almost 400 samples from dogs coming into city council pounds, SPCA shelters across both the North and South Islands. We looked for worm eggs in those fecal samples using a standard fecal flotation test. Now, one of the focuses of the study was to try and identify which of the two hookworm species dogs might have was actually present. And for this reason, most of the samples were collected over the warmer months of the year. Now, it really came down to which of the shelters contacted were willing to participate. And the numbers submitted from each were largely a function of how many dogs were coming through their doors. Now, not surprisingly, perhaps lots of samples were received from the two Auckland shelters, and the top two in the list, as well as Palmerston North's Pound and its SPCA. And we got fewer samples from the South Island, with most of the ones we did get coming from Christchurch. Now, the samples were processed with a zinc sulfate centrifugation flotation test, in which parasite eggs come to rest under the cover slip, which can then be transferred across to a microscope slide to be looked at under the microscope. Now, this technique is theoretically sensitive enough to pick up one egg in a 1 gram sample, but we know that not all eggs that rest under the cover slip will be successfully transferred. Now, for many samples that were shown to be positive with the flow, we then did a more traditional McMaster egg count, as we would generally do for sheep or cattle samples, to get an idea of the actual number of eggs. Now, the cover slip method is reliable for detecting not only nematode eggs, but also protozoan parasites such as Giardia. Now, the big gap is that no method currently available will reliably detect tapeworm infections. And we know that some tapeworm eggs will float at the specific gravity of 1.18, which is the zinc sulfate. But many will not, and in any case, most tapeworm eggs are retained in the segments passing out of the animals, rather than being released whilst worms are still resident in the gut as nematodes do. So what worm eggs were we expecting to see? And really it comes down to just three. The first is the thick-walled, tough and resistant egg of what is often described in the lay literature as the canine hook roundworm, Toxocara canis. The next is the thinner-walled, more elliptical egg of the hookworms. Now, two different species of hookworm have been described in New Zealand dogs, Uncinera stenocephala and Ankylostoma caninum. Although similar in overall appearance, their eggs are different sizes, and we intended to put that to use to see which hookworm egg was the more common one. And finally, the lemon-shaped, also tough and resistant egg of the whipworm, Tricurus vulpes. Now, quick summary of the importance of each worm. Toxocara canis is of greatest clinical importance in young puppies, many of which are infected even before they are born due to transmission of larvae across the placenta. Now, quite unlikely to affect the health of adult dogs, this parasite is, however, not one we would want to tolerate in any numbers in any dog, because it poses a zoonotic threat to humans and to children especially. Now, this nematode is also the only worm owners really ever see. Vomited up onto the kitchen floor or passed down in the poo, this big worm is the only one easily visible to the naked eye. Now, the question of how many puppies are born with this parasite was actually addressed in a recent research paper carried out overseas. Now, 54 puppies in 9 different litters of dogs of diverse breeds were examined, and 41, or 76%, were positive for Toxocara canis, with all 41 coming from the same 6 litters. Now, thus, the old advice that every puppy is born infected with this parasite is probably incorrect. But given that we can't pick up egg shedding until the pups are on their 4th week of life, and we'd want to treat them for this parasite well before that, it is probably best to assume that all puppies are actually born infected. Now, of the 2 hookworm species, Untitled was always assumed to be the commonest hookworm in New Zealand dogs. Now, this assumption was based on the fact that the early surveys done half a century ago only detected this worm, and also that it prefers cooler temperate climates, whereas Ankylostoma likes things a bit hotter. Now, hookworms are indeed little vampires and drink blood, but Untitled is quite sparing in its appetite, and you are perhaps more likely to see dogs with skin problems due to larval invasion of the dermal tissues than you are to see dogs with pale mucous membranes. Now, Ankylostoma, in contrast, is a much thirstier hookworm and can cause potentially fatal anemias in heavily infected dogs. Puppies often, since this parasite is one that, like Toxocara canis, can be transferred by mum, this time in her milk. Now, it was first described in racing greyhounds in this country in the 70s, likely imported with dogs from Australia, but we never knew whether it had spread significantly into the general dog population. So we are about to find out. Now, the last of the 3 nematodes is the whipworm, Tricurus vulpes. Now, this parasite lives in the large bowel, the cecum preferentially, whereas both Toxocara and the hookworms are in the small intestine. Now, there is no transmission from mum with this parasite. Now, arguably, this is a parasite that in particular takes advantage of when dogs are kept in unhygienic conditions. When surrounded by their own poo, infections can build over time, eventually tipping over to be clinically significant. Now, we do need to remember the limitations of what we did and recognize that some dogs that were infected may not have been picked up. Now, this applies, as I said, to tapeworms, but also to infections where the parasites are not yet laying eggs, or low-level infections where the true egg count is lower than the 1 or 2 eggs per gram we think we might just about be able to pick up. Now, with the focus on the summer months, we may have underestimated Toxocara infections, since there is data that suggests you're likelier to find the eggs of this parasite in winter. And finally, all those eggs that shouldn't have been there. A recent study suggested that as many as 1 in 3 Toxocara eggs found in dog feces are not in fact Toxocara canis, but the equivalent worm from cats, Toxocara cata. And likewise, over the years, we've seen all sorts of things in dog poo that shouldn't have been there. Sheep tapeworm eggs, for example. Now, overall, it was not too hard to find worm eggs. 29.3% were positive with 1, sometimes more than 1 type of egg. But obviously, we were unable to find nematode eggs in the feces of the majority of dogs. Now, across all dogs, Toxocara and hookworm eggs were the most common, whipworm the least common. In fact, this worm seems to have been declining over the years, and it used to arguably be the commonest worm we'd find in dogs. Now, hopefully that's telling us that we keep dogs in better conditions than we used to. In terms of other findings, well, we saw a bit of Coccidia or Cystoisospora, mostly in puppies, and a very small number of dogs with Giardia, only 3 in fact. Now, breaking things down, when we looked at dogs recorded as being 6 months old or less, so puppies, Toxocara was not surprisingly much more common, and many Toxocara positive puppies were also infected with hookworm. Now, the level of egg shedding was not a major focus of our studies, but we did look a little bit. And for Toxocara, there was a trend for younger dogs to have higher counts. Again, not an unexpected result from what we already know about this parasite. Now, a very different picture emerged in the older dogs, assuming the age recorded for each dog was accurate. Now, for these, which were the majority of those for which age was recorded, hookworm was the most common parasite egg found, and Toxocara was much less common. Now, was there a difference between the two islands? I posed this question not least because I have heard anecdotally that some think hookworm to be much less common in the South Island. Now, the overall data supported this notion, also suggesting that dogs in the South Island might be less wormy in general. But actually, this could be quite a misleading picture. There was a big difference between the dogs going through the centres in the two islands. Talking with the staff, there seemed to be a much bigger emphasis in the North Island on dealing with unwanted puppies than was happening in the South Island. So if we just compared the older dogs, 1 year of age or older, the difference between the two islands largely disappears. Now, whipworm may indeed be less common in the South Island, but I think we need a lot more samples from there to say this with any confidence. So which hookworm species did we find? We measured lots of eggs, as many as 50 from a single sample if we could easily get that many. There was a reasonable spread of egg sizes, but the average egg length conforms to what we would expect for Uncinera sternocephala. Could there, however, be a few ankylostomer eggs lurking in this data? We actually recently got a lot of samples from racing greyhounds, and their hookworm eggs were much shorter and highly likely to be Ankylostoma canina. Now, if Ankylostoma was lurking in the general dog population, I would have expected there to have been two peaks in the egg distribution data in the chart in blue, with the second peak centered around the 63 microns. And although the odd short egg was found in the pound sheltered dog samples, statistically, these are just as likely to be short Uncinera sternocephala eggs. Now, Ankylostoma is meant to be a more fecund parasite, laying more eggs, and I can't see it hiding as well as it would have to be doing. Now, in terms of the kind of hookworm egg counts we saw, there was a lot of variation. Now, using the much less sensitive McMaster, around 20% of samples that were positive using the flow were in fact recorded as 0 eggs per gram. Now, the median egg count was 300 eggs per gram, and 75% of samples were below 1,500. But some samples were in the high thousands, as you can see. Now, incidentally, we did measure some of the Toxocara eggs found in the dogs and compared them to those in some recent cat fecal samples. Now, the dots represent the average size of the eggs found per animal. And we found that, yes, quite a few eggs in the dog samples were the shorter cat size. Now, do we have any idea how these results compare? Now, we've been monitoring the frequency with which we can find worm eggs in dogs over the years. Now, by 2022, we'll have 40 complete years of data for samples from the pampered pooches belonging to the clients of the Massey Teaching Hospital. But a snapshot of relatively recent samples reveals that our new study from the pound shelter dogs suggests that the dogs in the shelters were wormier overall. But we should probably note that on average, they're also likely to be much younger. But then in comparison to similar data from our local pound, the new results are reasonably similar. Now, I'm processing nearly 400 samples. Although we didn't look exhaustively for them, we never saw any tapeworm segments, and we never saw there any tapeworm eggs. I do wonder, therefore, how prevalent tapeworm infections truly are, but we can't say anything from the data that we have, really. So in summary, worms were relatively common in the shelter dogs, Toxocara especially in the younger dogs, with a shift to the hookworm Uncinera in the older dogs. Now, given the limitations of the methods used that we've already talked about, however, we can't categorically say that a dog yielding a negative sample isn't in fact infected either with nematodes or indeed tapeworm. It is still not unreasonable to advocate for effective worming treatment of any new pet. But we should also be careful. Not all wormers are effective against Uncinera sternocephala, and likewise, efficacy against whipworm can also be variable. If we know what we're dealing with, we can make appropriate choices, but we'll only know that if we look. Now finally, greyhounds can, of course, also become pets too. And although this doesn't seem to have happened yet, rehoming ex-racing greyhounds could be an avenue for spreading ankylostomia into the general dog population. Let's hope that hasn't indeed already happened and doesn't in the future. And finally, just a quick thank you to all the staff who are working in the shelters and pounds that submitted quite a large number of samples, and to our techs, Barbara Adlington, Anne Tunnicliffe and Francis Miller for processing the samples, and finally to Kirsty Ingles, formerly of Bayer and now with Elanco, for sponsoring our study. And cheers everyone.